100% tariffs, and China responded with 3 words: "We don't care." Picture the exact moment before this became global news. A Japanese oil tanker crossed the Strait of Hormuz. Japan, America's closest Pacific ally for nearly 80 years, paid for safe passage in Chinese yuan rather than US dollars. That single decision, made by one crew on one ship in one narrow waterway, revealed more about the shifting balance of global power than any official press briefing this week. Here is what happened and how the world arrived at this point. Over the last 60 days, the United States constructed a naval blockade around Iran, spending an estimated $20 billion while deploying one of the harshest economic weapons available: 100% tariffs on Chinese imports. The strategy depended on one assumption: pressure China hard enough, force Beijing to retreat, and Iran's economy would eventually crack. But according to reporting from the Wall Street Journal and S&P Global, the opposite happened. Washington publicly threatened China with tariffs equal to the total value of every Chinese product entering the American market. This was not a normal trade dispute. It was one of the strongest economic threats possible short of outright economic warfare. The message from Washington was direct. China had to choose between access to American markets and continued purchases of Iranian oil. Choose incorrectly, and the financial consequences would be severe. China received the warning, evaluated it, and then answered publicly in front of governments, financial institutions, and trade ministries from Ankara to Jakarta. 3 words: "We don't care." Not privately, not quietly, publicly. And that detail matters because the statement was never really intended for Washington. The real audience was every country that has spent years complying with American pressure out of habit instead of necessity. Finance ministries around the world immediately began asking the same question. If China can withstand 100% tariffs, the most powerful economic weapon Washington can realistically deploy, and still continue buying Iranian oil, then how much weight do American threats actually carry for smaller nations? That realization carries enormous consequences. Once threats begin losing credibility, countries slowly become less willing to obey them. Not through dramatic announcements, but through quiet policy decisions by governments that once complied automatically and are now reconsidering their position. China's response did more than protect Iranian oil sales. It weakened confidence in America's ability to use economic pressure as a global tool. Now focus again on the Japanese tanker, because this is no longer just a shipping story. It is a story about global finance and monetary power. Japan remains the world's 3rd largest economy and one of America's closest strategic allies. For decades, it has operated deep inside the American-led financial and security structure. Yet a Japanese vessel still paid Iran in yuan, not because Tokyo suddenly turned against Washington, and not because Japanese leaders adopted anti-American views, but because that is increasingly what access to energy through that route now requires. Japan was not making a political statement. It was making a practical economic decision. To understand why that matters, you have to understand the petrodollar system. Since 1974, Saudi Arabia has priced oil almost exclusively in US dollars in exchange for American military protection. That arrangement became one of the pillars of American financial dominance. Because oil is traded in dollars, countries around the world must hold dollars to buy energy. That constant demand helps keep U.S. borrowing costs low and keeps the international financial system centered around American institutions. Former French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing once called this arrangement the exorbitant privilege. Japan using yuan in the Strait of Hormuz represents one of America's closest allies operating outside that framework, not for ideological reasons but because operational reality increasingly demands it. Harvard economist and former IMF chief economist Kenneth Rogoff argued that Iran is aggressively pushing yuan-based trade to avoid American sanctions while deepening financial ties with China. At the same time, China has steadily expanded yuan usage across its own trade network and among BRICS nations. Iran has effectively transformed a military choke point into a financial leverage point. The Strait of Hormuz is no longer just an oil route. It is gradually becoming a mechanism through which the petrodollar system weakens, one payment, one tanker, and one transaction at a time. Iran's parliament was reportedly preparing measures to formalize the system. One lawmaker explained it clearly. We provided security, and naturally oil tankers should pay for it. What Iran achieved here is significant. America's blockade was designed to isolate Iran economically from the waterway. Instead, Iran repositioned itself as the gatekeeper of that same route, collecting payments in its preferred currency from ships that would rather pay than remain delayed. The blockade was intended to weaken Iran. Iran answered by turning itself into a toll operator. Now look at what this means for ordinary Americans. Gas prices in the United States have climbed to roughly 4.46 per gallon and continue rising. Midterm elections are approaching, and every increase at the pump creates political pressure inside the United States, pressure Iran's strategy appears designed to exploit. The blockade required 60 days and billions of dollars to construct. Yet drivers across America are already paying part of that cost every time they stop for fuel. Beyond fuel prices, the broader economic risk is becoming increasingly important. S&P Global data shows that WAN accounted for only 3.7% of international trade settlements in 2024, compared to less than 1% in 2012. That shift was already underway before Iranian oil transactions began moving through yuan. The Strait of Hormuz simply accelerated the trend by forcing nations to prioritize energy access over ideological alignment. As Kenneth Rogoff observed, major global shifts rarely happen overnight. They emerge gradually through repeated habits and practical necessity. Now consider the railway network, because if yuan payments reveal changes in financial systems, the rail corridor reveals something even deeper. The physical infrastructure supporting this transformation was built long before the crisis intensified. The China-Iran rail corridor reportedly became operational around May 2025. It links Tehran directly with Chinese cities, cutting shipping times from roughly 30 to 40 days by sea down to nearly 12 to 15 days over land. That timing matters. The railway now helping Iranian oil bypass American naval pressure was completed nearly 9 months before the blockade began. It was not built in reaction to the crisis. It was built in preparation for exactly this scenario. According to Special Eurasia, the rail system reduces the risk of Western naval interception. The route stretches through Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan into China using corridors no American Navy can effectively block. Naval blockades can restrict sea access. They cannot stop trains moving across Eurasia. Pakistan reportedly opened 6 additional border crossings to facilitate Iran-bound trade. Turkey's strategic interests also pushed Ankara toward helping Tehran reduce blockade pressure. Iran's Food Industry Association confirmed the activation of northern rail and land routes alongside the Caspian Sea alternative. This was not an improvised reaction. It was the result of years spent building backup systems for trade and energy transportation, each one less vulnerable to American maritime control. The United States attempted to isolate one nation only to discover that nation was deeply connected to a larger regional system of trade, geography, and strategic interests. And this may be the most important reality of all. Systems are far harder to dismantle than policies. The yuan-based payment structure developing around the Strait of Hormuz will likely remain even after any ceasefire. The Tehran-Beijing rail connection will still exist after any diplomatic agreement. China's public commitment to continue buying Iranian oil despite tariff threats is now permanently on record. Analysts increasingly argue that these developments were not designed simply to survive a crisis, but to establish a lasting alternative to the American-led economic order. Notably, no major administration official has yet provided a detailed public response addressing the railway system, yuan transactions, and China's public defiance together as one strategic development. That silence is meaningful. 3 possible outcomes now dominate discussion. The first is that American economic pressure overwhelms Iran before the alternative system becomes fully operational, forcing Tehran into a nuclear agreement. The second possibility, which many analysts now consider increasingly realistic, is that the alternative trade network stabilizes Iran long enough to outlast American political tolerance for rising gas prices and mounting blockade costs. The third, and perhaps most significant possibility, is that regardless of how the Iran conflict ends, the yuan payment system, Eurasian railway network, and China's open defiance have already proven that an alternative to dollar-dominated trade is no longer theoretical. It already exists in practice. Ultimately, the real issue may not be policy at all. It may be about who is willing to absorb the cost. The family paying $4.46 per gallon without ever hearing the term petrodollar. The government deciding for the first time that following Washington's demands may cost more than resisting them. The allied country paying in yuan because access to energy now requires it. These are not abstract theories. These are real-world decisions being made in real time. Type A if you believe the blockade can still succeed before the alternative system fully expands. Type B if you think the railway and UN system have already made the original blockade strategy outdated. Type C if you believe the real story is the long-term decline of dollar dominance, with the Iran conflict serving only as the accelerator.